Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Bert and Lou, the story of the Herbert Hoover family with the Hoover Presidential Library. So we're going to learn about the life of our 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, and his wife, Lou Henry Hoover. Born in Iowa, the Hoovers would become world travelers and spend much of their lives in public service, helping provide food relief to millions of people around the world. This presentation will include film clips of home movies created by Lou and the first known color moving images of the White House. And this program is led by Craig G. Wright, who is the Supervisory Archivist at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. So all 100 of us or so who are watching live and the many more that will watch on demand, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Craig for joining us this afternoon. And Craig, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Robert. As Robert said, Bert and Lou, the story of the Herbert Hoover family. The family, I'm an archivist here, so I get to read all the family correspondence. And the family always referred to the president as Bert. This is a great photograph to introduce you to the family. So the tall man on the left is Herbert Hoover Jr., who was always known in the family as Herbert. His wife, Margaret. Lou Henry Hoover is holding their first male grandson, Herbert Hoover III, who I was fortunate enough to meet. A very nice man. He said that the family ran out of nicknames for Herbert, so they called him Pete, after the family cat. And his legal name was Herbert Hoover III, but he signed his checks Pete Hoover. The president, Herbert Hoover, there is holding his first grandchild, Margaret. It was known as Peggy Ann. Both sons ended up marrying Margarets. And the tall man on the far right is Alan Hoover, his second son, who at the time was a bachelor. And while he was president, the society pages often referred to him as the most eligible bachelor in Washington. This photograph was taken at their home in Palo Alto on the Stanford campus on election eve, 1928. And the thing that's always made me curious is the silhouette of the woman that's inside the house. I wish I know who she was and what she thought about what was going on. This is the two birth homes of the Hoovers. On the left, the taller home is in Waterloo, Iowa. That was the birthplace of Lou Henry Hoover. That is no longer there. They have a little park that has a nice statue to Lou Henry there. And on the right-hand side there is the birthplace cottage of Herbert Hoover, the first president born west of the Mississippi. It's basically a 2.5-room cottage. It looks pretty much exactly the same as this old photograph today. It's actually in the middle. Our library is in the middle of a small national park. And so the National Park Service takes care of the Hoover birthplace cottage. Lou, I start with Lou Henry because she was born first. So she was born in March 1874. Her father, Charles Henry, worked as a banker. She was extremely close to her father. She had the younger girl you can see in the photograph is her sister Jean. Their mother developed chronic bronchitis and periodically moved to locations they thought might help alleviate some of her distress. First to Southern Iowa. That didn't work. They moved back to Waterloo, Texas, where actually Lou writes about meeting and her fascination with meeting African-American children. Then they moved back to Waterloo. They try Kansas, and when that doesn't work out, they don't go back to Waterloo. They keep going to California in 1887. She attended 3 colleges. She initially enrolled in Los Angeles Normal School, which many of you may know the normal schools were teachers' colleges, essentially. And today that's UCLA. After her sophomore year, her parents had moved to Monterey, so she changed schools to San Jose Normal School, where she graduated, which is San Jose State University today. And essentially, she worked for a while in the bank, realized quite quickly that women were not going to be able to move very far within the bank hierarchy. She did use her teaching degree briefly and decided that really wasn't what she wanted to do. She heard a lecture on geology from a professor at a relatively new school, Stanford. So when she goes to Stanford, she's getting her second degree. Herbert Hoover, obviously born in that small birthplace cottage you saw earlier, a few months later, had an older brother, Theodore, always known as Tad by the family, and a younger sister, Mary, always known as May. His father died when he was 6 years old. His mother, who was very active in the Quaker Church, died when he was 9 years old, and then the children were split up to live with different relatives. His sister went to live with their maternal grandmother out in Sioux City, Iowa. Tad went to live with family and farm on South Central Iowa, and Bert lived just a couple miles out of West Branch with an uncle. As it mentions there, he would attend Stanford. He was the youngest student in the first pioneer freshman class when Stanford first opened up, and he had not gone to high school, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. He would become a mining engineer based out of London, and he worked in California, as you say, California, London, Australia, China, eventually all over the world. This is his primary profession until he begins his life as a public servant. After living for about a year with his local uncle, he moved to Oregon to live with his uncle, Henry John Minthorn, who was a doctor and school superintendent. Shortly thereafter, they moved to Salem, set up the Oregon Land Company. The Hoovers were Quakers, and his uncle, they were trying to set up in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, essentially a Quaker stronghold. Not only just buy land, but you could buy pre-existing businesses. And Hoover would work at the land office, sort of signing as a witness and he had gone to business school, classes in the evenings, and learned some clerical work. So he would be a typist and doing that kind of work at his uncle's land company. Lou, who's living in California now, there's a picture of her when she's 17. When she's 15, she writes a school essay, which I think is quite remarkable, called An Independent Girl. An independent girl is a person before whose wrath only the most rash dare stand, and it must be confessed with much fear and trembling. We'll revisit another piece of this essay in a few slides. She was also a valedictorian of her high school class. Bert, when he applies to go to Stanford, which is still being built when he applied, he took the admission test. As I mentioned, he had not gone to high school. He had failed the test initially. Joseph Swain, who was proctoring the test, who was also a Quaker, felt that Herbert Hoover had done quite remarkable considering he had not attended high school. So he advised him to go down to Palo Alto and get tutored over the summer and take the admission exams again, which Herbert Hoover did. He passed them all, except for English. So they called it conditioned, which meant he would need to write a paper that met the approval of the English department before he would be allowed to graduate from Stanford. While he was there was the first Stanford-Cal football game, which is evidently quite a big deal. I grew up in Michigan. It'd be similar to the Michigan State game, I guess. At this time, Stanford, there was no tuition. Stanford's son had passed away, and so it's a university that was unique and one of the first colleges at the time. Normally, it was really the sons and occasionally the daughters of the fairly wealthy who went to college. Stanford has an influx of more what you might consider middle-class students, and the rich students called the other students barbarians. And Hoover and his circle of friends said, there's a lot more of us here So they essentially adopted the pejorative barbarian and became the Barbarian Party and were elected to all the student offices for quite a few years. And for one term, Herbert Hoover was a treasurer of Stanford. It came towards the end of his time at Stanford, and he was considered sort of the star of the geology department, but he had not passed that English requirement yet. So Professor J.P. Smith called him into his office and said, "Hey, this is the best paper you've written while at Stanford. Take it home over the weekend and correct all the grammar and spelling errors. And on Monday, we'll go in and take care of that condition status in English." When Hoover arrived on Monday, the Professor Smith sort of looked at it, shook his head, went into his office and made the corrections, and they went down together to get Hoover so he was going to be able to graduate from Stanford. He was noted, as they say, he was noted as first-class executive ability. There were one of the professors heard a couple of the students making fun of Hoover, saying he wasn't the top of his class academically, and the professor interrupted them and said, "Hoover does all of his work, which is more than any of you can say, and 90% of success is actually doing all of your work." This is some photographs of Lou while she's at Stanford. She is a member of a sorority. And again, you can sort of get a sense, her photographs and her writing style is much more informal. You get a sense of what she thinks about the world when you read her letters and her essays. Bert's a lot closer to the vest and a little more dense in the way he writes. Bert had actually gotten a job out in Australia after he graduated, and he sends a cable now after Lou graduates to ask her to marry him. At the time, there was no cable across the Pacific Ocean. So the message went from Australia to London, to New York, to San Francisco, where Lou was living with 3 or 4 other young women. And she was not home at the time that the telegram arrived. So it got posted to their house bulletin board, and all of her roommates knew about the proposal before she did. And as I like to tell the students when I'm giving tours here, how many people text? Well, of course, all the students raised their hand, and they said, how many people pay $1 per word? Because that's what it cost to send a cable in those days. So Lou's response was a single word, yes. This is their parents' house in Monterey. It's not there anymore. There's a motel there currently. And you can tell they were going to get married and go to Hoover's new job in China. And her mother writes a letter saying they had made up their minds not to like him very well, as he's going to take Lou so far away. But after he'd been here a few days, I think we all liked him about as much as Lou did. So Hoover doesn't have this reputation, but to me, this is evidence that if he wanted to be charming, he could. Not something people associate with him later in life. And as I mentioned, we'll go back to the Independent Girl essay where Lou writes, sooner or later, she is sure to meet a spirit equally as independent as her own. And then there's a clash of arms ending in mortal combat, or they unite their forces and with combined strength go forth to meet the world. So she found someone, Bert and her did the latter. They got married. And here's some photographs of their marriage at their parents' house. That's Jean with Bert on the left side. And really that's all the people, Lou, her parents, her sister, Bert, and then Bert's brother, Tad, is taking that photograph. They literally then go to San Francisco for their wedding night. And on the next day, they board a ship, literally the slow boat to China. And I believe at the time it took about 5 weeks to cross the Pacific in a steamer. And they begin their honeymoon in China. They are actually there during the Boxer Rebellion. You'll see that in a second here, but there's a photo of Lou on the left during the siege. On the right, her sister Jean comes to visit her, and they're in Japan when that photograph is taken around 1900. So the Boxer Rebellion, again, there's a better shot of Lou with one of the artillery pieces. On the right-hand side is a map of the city they were in, Xianxian. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that properly. I believe it's either Bert or Lou, but I believe that's Lou's hand-drawn map of the area. And if you see sort of the darker orange area, there's sort of an oval on the bottom of that big circle. That's where all of the foreigners were under siege for about 4 weeks. The Boxers had taken over. You can see it looks like a little bit of a fort above it. The Boxers had overrun the fort and they were shelling the area where the foreigners were. We have from diaries of their friends that the shells were always done in threes. It might be 15 seconds or 30 seconds or 90 seconds, but they always fired 3 times. And one of their neighbors' diaries, after the first explosion, Lou went out into the courtyard to see what was going on, and they all said, "Lou, go back inside. There's 2 more coming." And there's also a story of them playing cards in their living room when an artillery shell actually blew off their front porch. No one was hurt, but that's how serious they were. There were actually reports in California that Lou died, which was not true, but it took quite a while for communication for her to get word back to her family that she was not dead. And you can get a little sense of her personality here because she writes to her close friend, Evelyn White, "You missed one of the opportunities of your life by not coming to China in the summer of 1900. You should have been here at the most interesting siege and bombardment of the age." So she seems to be a fairly fearless young lady, and there's plenty of evidence within her letters that that's the case. After the siege is lifted, Lou returns to California. Bert becomes a full partner in the London firm that he is working for. Here's some pictures on the left in Trafalgar Square. Lou hamming it up, which we have lots of impersonal photos like this, which was unusual for the time. And the bottom photo is they're going through the Suez Canal. Lou kept a series of photo albums, scrapbooks of their journeys, and she would make notations. So for example, that ship there says that was the 5th time they'd been through the Suez Canal, and it listed the dates of all the times they'd been in the Suez Canal. Their home was based in London. This is their first automobile. I do not know the make, but it was a 1903. You can see Lou behind the wheel, and she was known for driving. As a matter of fact, when she was first lady, she would drive herself around Washington, D.C., and occasionally the newspapers would sort of express shock in their headlines, like, "The first lady is driving a car. What is this country coming to?" She was also rather notorious in Palo Alto for speeding. The police just overlooked this. They all knew her car. And about Lou, one of her sons tried to take advantage of that. So they took her car out and were speeding, and they immediately got pulled over. And the police told them that, "You don't look anything like your mother. Don't let this happen again." They have 2 sons, Herbert Jr. and Alan. We saw them earlier as adults. Here's some photographs of them as children. They were both born in London while Hoover was still based in London as a mining engineer. He does speak a little more eloquently when he's talking about children and fishing and peace. Other than that, he tends to speak very monotone. But here's a couple of the quotes he has about boys. And I like, "Boys imitate their dads in spite of all efforts to teach them good manners. And boys are very durable. A boy, if not washed too often and if kept in a cool place after each accident, will survive broken bones, hornet's nests, swimming pools, and 5 helpings of pie." World War I breaks out while the Hoovers are in London. And one of the first things that they do is try to assist all these Americans who are visiting Europe. They all wish to return to the United States. And there's a committee of American residents in London, as the headline there is, and they help organize and facilitate berths on ships so people can get transportation back to the United States while things are hopefully still safe. Herbert Hoover works more on the sort of the financial end. Lou immediately goes to ask how she can help, and they make her in charge of working with women with children. If there's no male, in those days, if there was a male, then you always worked with the male. In her case, and then so she has a very interesting, extensive report talking about how her activities changed over the 3 weeks or so that this organization was involved. And I've noticed down there, she mentions seeing 3 little girls under 15 from a Belgian convent having a romantically exciting time, and the lone little one of 12 whose wide, terror-filled eyes had seen more of war than a little girl should. So once this committee, they're already starting to work before that committee ends, because the Germans have overrun Belgium and part of France. The United States at the time is neutral, so they create sort of a prototype NGO, non-governmental organization, to organize food relief for Belgium and occupied France. The Commission for Relief in Belgium, as you can see, they had their own flag. They help feed millions of people. And they actually have to negotiate because the British have a naval blockade of Belgium, and Hoover has to negotiate with both the Germans and make sure in the British. And so in order to allow the British for them to allow the food ships through, Hoover has to promise that none of the bags, the cloth bags that the food comes in, will be the Germans. They can't let the Germans have it because those can be used in artillery. So every single cotton bag has to be accounted for. And they basically took pains to do that. When the United States enters the war, we're no longer neutral. So Hoover gets recalled to Washington, and he works with Woodrow Wilson. Wilson makes him head of the United States Food Administration. They're trying to conserve food to get over to soldiers and the civilians in war-torn World War I Europe. One of the things I find interesting, you can see from the cartoon on the right, who already at this time, a lot of Hoover's appeals are to women and wives, because he feels they are often in charge of food in households. And so you really need to get the women to buy into your ideas in order to help conserve food. At the time, they were very successful, and Hoover becomes part of the language as the word Hooverize. So if you're conserving, I tell students a few years ago when gas was so expensive, a lot of families were conserving gas and not driving around as much. I said if this was happening in 1918, they would have been told they were Hooverizing gas. In this case, Hooverizing food. 2 million children signed pledges to not eat meat on Mondays and wheat on Wednesdays. A variety of interesting food conservation measures that were enacted while the Food Administration was going. After the war ends, Hoover is actually fairly close to Woodrow Wilson, and he's part of the Paris Peace Conference. He's actually starting to organize food relief to Europe in the wake and the aftermath of World War I. And you can sort of see from this map, the American Relief Administration, some of the areas that they help feed people. That first winter of 1919, it was primarily in Central Europe. And then over the next couple of years, it was Eastern Europe, and even in Russia and the Ukraine, which are in the news, obviously, for different reasons today. This is one of the first times where you'll notice that little food relief package, $10. You could actually specify what family. So this is a way for people to get food directly to their families rather than just going into large volumes of food that were going to lots of people. Very successful program. And Hoover gets a worldwide reputation as a humanitarian for feeding millions of people, beginning with the CRB and the ARA. They both obviously are famous, newsworthy people. I do occasionally like to point out that Lou Henry made the cover of Time magazine several years before her husband did. They had a shared passion for the outdoors. Hoover loved to fish. Lou, we mentioned home movies. You can sort of see she's actually has a film camera there. Again, Hoover was a little more eloquent sometimes when he's speaking about fishing. One of my favorite quotes is, "The equality of men, for all men are equal before fish." Doesn't matter what your race, religion, or ideology, they obviously all want to catch fish and eat them. So, and here is our first clip. It's a home movie from a little bit later, 1929, when they're on fishing. I believe this is off the coast of Florida, if I remember correctly. In just a second, you'll sort of see Herbert Hoover. This is the whole fishing group. Hoover's noted that if he got back at the end of the day and he had not caught the most fish, he'd go back out until he at least had it. There he is with his hat on. There's the he is president at the time, and not a lot of film from this period in time. So I'm glad that, and a lot of this has not weathered time very well. So many of these images are very washed out and hard to see, or very dark, but sort of there's Lou. So Lou, I wanted to make sure we got to the point where you got to see Lou. She wasn't as much into fishing as her husband was. She loved horse riding, and he wasn't that much into horse riding. So in 1920, a lot of people don't know that actually Hoover made a run for president in 1920. Pretty much so far, everything he's touched has turned out very well. Hoover has not been political at all. So he's being recruited by both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And one of the fascinating things we found was a letter that Franklin Roosevelt wrote in 1920. Had some nice talks with Herbert Hoover before he went west for Christmas. He was certainly a wonder, and I wish we could make him president of the United States. There could not be a better one. He's not going to say that in 1932, of course, and I think he was a very big supporter of the League of Nations. And I believe that if either the Democrats or the Republicans had come out in support of the League of Nations, that is who Herbert Hoover would have declared his party affiliation. Unfortunately, neither party supported the League of Nations, and in late March of 1920, Hoover finally declares himself to be a Republican. So I grew up in Michigan, and things were not as centralized back in those days. And Herbert Hoover appears on both primaries in Michigan in 1920. He comes in fourth in the Republican primary. He comes in first in the Democratic primary. Our second piece here is, while he was Secretary of Commerce, there's an early experiment in television, and hopefully you'll be able to hear.
On April 7th, 1927, the telephone was 51 years old. In a New York auditorium, a handful of people were given a glimpse of the future. It was called television. The show, if you could call it that, originated in Washington, D.C. and starred Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce. This first crude transmission was the work of engineers from Bell Laboratories. They had invented the transmission system not for the sake of entertainment, but to learn more about long-distance networks. At the time, few people realized just how successful the experiment would turn out to be. Today, the phone company is still deeply involved in television. In fact, the network shows you enjoy, including the one you're watching now, are brought to you through the facilities of the Bell system. In the 100-year history of the telephone, there have been many important moments. This has been one of them.
So that was an advertisement by Bell Labs much later, but sort of tells briefly the story. While Secretary of Commerce in 1927, there's an enormous flood of the Mississippi. 600,000 people are made homeless. It was really certainly the worst disaster in that area until Hurricane Katrina. And Herbert Hoover, because of his logistical expertise, the governors of the 7 affected states asked Calvin Coolidge to assign Herbert Hoover to help. There's no FEMA at the time. So they'd ask Herbert Hoover, and normally in those days, the government would work through the Red Cross to try to help disaster relief. So here's some images. We have 3 wonderful photo albums that document the severity of that flood. One of my favorite ones on the left there, in order to save their car, they drive it up steps to the porch of their house so that the flood doesn't ruin their car. But this is where Hoover radio was also something fairly new, and sort of like the computer of its day. So all of a sudden, because of this flood, Hoover's name is on the radio every day. And so when the 1928 election comes around, everybody knows who he is, and he sort of wins in a landslide. As I sort of show here, this is the same day as the photo I originally showed you, but it's pulled back. You can see the Stanford students are cheering Hoover on election night. John Philip Sousa actually has a march that he has his band play for Hoover. And on the right-hand side there, they're at the White House. His son, Herbert Jr., actually becomes ill. So the grandchildren move into the White House, and it's the first time there were young children in the White House for quite some time. And I've got a little bit of a film of this. It wasn't taken by Lou, but it's from her home movies. Well, actually, this must be a newsreel because there's sound to it. This is out outside the White House. Margaret, the daughter-in-law, with 2 of the grandchildren and a dog. They had many dogs, and people kept sending them more dogs, so they had to sort of tell them not to send us any more dogs. And here is well, we've not been able to find any color moving images that predate this. This is a technology that was only around for about 2 years. The film itself is not color. It's a technology that had 3 different colored light bulbs inside the film projector, yellow, red, and blue. And the film was scored. If you look at this, hopefully you might be able to see there's some lines in it. So when the color from those light bulbs went through the scores, it's like a prism, and that caused the film to become colored, the image to become colorized. All right. Lou is extremely active in the Girl Scouts, beginning when she was giving speeches back to help promote food conservation during World War I. She was at a session where one of the other speakers was from the Girl Scouts, and she said she always claimed that she was a Girl Scout before there were Girl Scouts, and so she was very active with the organization over the years and increased membership, I think 100-fold. So they also created Camp Rapidan, which is part of Shenandoah National Park, if any of our viewers have been out there. It's actually an hour or so away from the visitor center, so you have to take a bus trip there. They've rebuilt a couple of the buildings there at Camp Rapidan. When Hoover left office, he gave this to the United States as a gift. Unfortunately, it was not wheelchair accessible, so it would have perhaps become Camp David, but that would come later. We do know that Nixon and I believe Carter both visited the camp when they were president, and the Park Service runs it, and occasionally they get a hold of us and said, hey, we've got a 3-hour round trip bus trip, any new stories that you have about Camp Rapidan. So we forward them some of the stories that we've run across over the years for them to relate to the visitors. So you just noticed in the color film, they were playing with a medicine ball in front of the White House. And Hoover's doctor said that he needed exercise. So they created a game called Hoover Ball, which is a little bit sort of like a cross between tennis and volleyball, but you use a 6-pound medicine ball. So you're not going to spike that, you're going to break your arm. So you can sort of see you have to catch it and heave this over the net. And actually every August, the World Championships are held here in West Branch around the time of Hoover's birthday. I believe Maryland still has a year-long league out there. And if anyone's interested in this at all, you can really check YouTube and Hoover Ball, because evidently there's quite a few schools who use Hoover Ball occasionally as part of their phys ed program. So this was called the Medicine Cabinet. The people that he's playing with are for the most part members of the cabinet of his presidency, and they would go out every morning and play Hoover Ball for about an hour. He runs again in 32, and as we all know, he loses by a bigger margin than he won in 28. Not uncommon at those times to do trains. Now the picture on the right is actually not from the 1932 campaign. I believe it's from 1930, the midterms, but it's the only public display of affection I've ever seen in any of our thousands and thousands of photographs. And Lou had been away working on some of her own projects for a week. And this is the first time that Bert saw her. And normally, as I think because of his Quaker upbringing, he didn't really do things very emotional in front of the press. But in this case, evidently he couldn't help himself. So he gives her a peck on the cheek where the reporters are able to get a shot of that on camera. Sort of like Jimmy Carter. I think in my opinion, Jimmy Carter and Herbert Hoover probably had the most active post-presidencies. And Hoover's begins in 1946. As World War II ends, Harry Truman recruits him to take a look at the food situation and help alleviate hunger around the world in the wake of World War II, just as he had done in the wake of World War I. Here's some images from that time, but one of the things I found interesting is Maurice Pates, who was the director of UNICEF and actually had helped Hoover, worked with Hoover during the CRB era, has some interesting comments about this time, about how they gave hope to 38 countries groping for guidance in the bewildered post-war world. And for cereals, the wolf of famine will go away from the door on September 1st. And American leadership was not merely slogans for a world on the brink of starvation. And we have a little clip talks about that.
Back to Washington comes Herbert Hoover. The 71-year-old former president, now honorary chairman of the Famine Emergency Committee, completes his 25-day survey of food supplies in Latin America. And with new supplies promised, he has words of hope on the fight against famine overseas.
The result of the whole of 3 months has been to find a fine cooperation throughout the world, a willingness to sacrifice, and a complete devotion to the fact that human life has never been so endangered as at the present moment. I believe we shall obtain the mastery of this famine if we can maintain this devotion for another 3 months.
And the nation answers.
So he mentioned there that that leg was the second leg of his world tour where he went down through Central and South America. There was actually the first leg, he had gone around Europe, through Egypt and then Asia. And one of the things that he thought was imperative at the time was one of the few countries that could actually was producing enough food to export was Argentina. Argentina at the time was not very friendly with the United States. They were not friends. And so when Herbert Hoover was in Rome, he had an audience with the Pope. And so later when he met with the Argentinian president, he made his plea not from the United States, but from the Pope. And that was key in getting Argentina to agree to export food in the wake of World War II there. So there is a photograph of their grave sites. Bert and Lou had died in 1944 and was in California, but when Herbert Hoover died, he wanted to be buried here in West Branch, overlooking his birthplace cottage. You can't quite make it out in the tree line there, but you can see his birthplace cottage from the grave site. And the Park Service doesn't really allow trees to grow to block the view because in accordance with his wishes. So there's your nickel tour of the Bert and Lou story. I'm certainly open for any questions now.
So folks, let's give Craig a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. And let's take 10 to 12 minutes of questions here. We have plenty of time. So let me jump. So if you have questions, try to put them in the Q&A. If you have comments, try to put them in the chat. I'll try to keep both things separately. Lois asks, do we know why Herbert Hoover lost his rebid for presidency?
Well, I'll let the political scientists debate that, but there's plenty of historians that think because of the onset of the Great Depression and things were so bad that whoever was president at the time probably would have lost. I think there's a lot to say about that because, like I said, the Great Depression began during Hoover's administration, and a lot of people argue that the president really doesn't have that much influence on whether the economy is successful or not. Regardless, they'll take the blame or get the credit. So I think that had a lot to do with it. That there's also a factor, I believe, there was a lot of people who were hoping prohibition was the law of the land at the time, and Herbert Hoover was certainly, and the Republican Party were in favor of the continuation of our dry policies and prohibition, but increasingly more and more folks and then wanted prohibition repealed. And when Roosevelt was in office, they did get rid of prohibition. So those are probably the two main factors.
Tish asks, did Lou keep a journal or diary of any kind that has since been published?
Not published. She did keep a number of journals, not so much during her adult life. We have a very extensive journal during her first 2 years when she was at Los Angeles Normal School. That's where I found out she'd actually been down in mines with her father long before Herbert Hoover ever thought about going down in a mine. It also shows her personality. So we have a lot of small, almost monthly diaries covering about 12 years that she did. She also has, I think for social reasons, she has a diary while she was First Lady about what she was wearing at all the events. But nothing like a personal journal post First Lady. And really the vast majority of it is from earlier in her life.
Cindy asks, when film was colorized, did they inquire what color the dresses, the vests, and the clothing were, or was it random and left up to the person who was colorizing the film?
No, that's a great question. Now, there is one company that knows the codes from that old technology. So that's the only company that's able to restore accurately the color. And so that's why we got a special grant to allow us to colorize the 7 films that we discovered. Actually, later this year, we're going to explore our original film. And as I mentioned, the original film is not color, is stored near Kansas City. And so we're going to actually review a few more films. I suspect we're going to find maybe another 10 or so colorized films. But actually, that is, as far as we know, because there was coding within that technology, we believe that the color is reflective of what that camera recorded.
JD asks, why did Lou have 2 traditionally male names?
Well, that's a great question. Some people have speculated that her father wanted a son. Another little interesting side story, when I first began work here at the Hoover Library back in 2004, if you went to Wikipedia, it said Louise Henry Hoover, which is incorrect. That is not her legal name. I contacted them via email and said, would you please correct that? Her birth name is Lou. And Henry, just as an aside, Henry is the family name. So Henry's often thought of as a male first name, but that is the family name. Last name was Henry. Anyway, so Wikipedia responded to me by saying they don't take partisan politics on their page. And I'm not quite sure why correcting her name is partisan politics. So then I sent them a copy of Lou's passport, which is a legal document, which uses her legal name, just as evidence that that was her given name. And they said, we don't accept primary source materials at Wikipedia. So I went home that night and I registered as an anonymous contributor, and I changed her name to Lou, and they had no problem with it. Now, I don't think that's the way it works anymore, but I'm just saying, back in 2004, that's how things were working. So I was able to correct her name by being an anonymous person as opposed to an employee that would know her name.
Oh, Craig, that's a funny story. Terry asks, if you could recommend one book on Herbert Hoover, what would it be?
There's probably the best book on Herbert Hoover for his entire life is written by Kenneth Wright. It's fairly recent. He's a Canadian historian who spent a lot of time down here, and it's very balanced. Most of the Hoover biographies reflect strongly if the person liked Hoover or disliked Hoover, they emphasize one side or the other. David Berner, who did a book quite a while ago, was it the 80s, do you remember? Yeah, I think it was in the 80s. His was the first really balanced. Yes, Hoover had his strengths and Hoover had his weaknesses, just like any other human being. The only weakness in David Berner's book is it doesn't go in, doesn't cover the extent of his post-presidential activities. But overall, I'd say it's a great book, which was not eclipsed until Kenneth White, W-H-Y-T-E. I don't remember the name off the top of my head. Do you? No. But it's only a couple years old, and it's a very balanced book and a very thorough book. So if you want Herbert Hoover's entire life, that Kenneth White book is the best. There is a book on the presidency but it's only the presidency. So that's probably the best recommendation because that gives you the totality of his life.
So Mike wants to know, when and why was the Hoover Dam named for him?
Okay, that's an interesting. So while he was Secretary of Commerce, they've been for years talking about a dam on the Colorado to help with flooding, electrical power, and irrigation in the West. And of course, the Hoover Dam has been in the news a lot lately because of the climate and the fact that they're losing water. So Herbert Hoover was assigned to work with the 7 states to come up with a compromise because they were arguing about water rights, and they adopted something called the Hoover Compromise that they all agreed to. Well, they all agreed to except Arizona. Arizona was the hold. Last time, I think California was the holdout. Currently, at the old days, it was Arizona. And the Congress actually had to pass a resolution saying only 6 states had to agree in order to move forward. And I think Arizona didn't really adopt it until the late 40s or the 50s. So I'd have to look that up. But anyway, so while he was Secretary of Commerce, he was part of the Colorado River Commission, which sort of did the groundwork for the building of the dam. And then the states had to ratify it. So they weren't ratified by 6 states until he was president. So it actually becomes basically a work project to help workers during the Depression. On the day that they actually start laying the railroad tracks to the city they're going to build to house the workers, the Secretary of the Interior at the time, Ray Lyman Wilbur, called it the Hoover Dam. And just like I mentioned about the biographies before, people who liked Hoover called it the Hoover Dam, and people who hated Hoover called it the Boulder Dam. Now, the Boulder Dam, it's weird because there's really not a great reason for it to be called the Boulder Dam. But originally, when the government released funds to explore where the dam would be, they thought it would be in Boulder Canyon. And when they did the survey, they realized it was too unstable. They could not build the dam in Boulder Canyon. So it got built at its current location. And for the most part, it was usually referred to as the Hoover Dam. When he lost the election, Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of the Interior for Franklin Roosevelt, and I'm not saying this is Franklin Roosevelt, but Harold Ickes hated Hoover. And so he made a declaration that no government publication could refer to it as the Hoover Dam. They only could call it the Boulder Dam. One of the interesting things is if you look at the promotional materials from local motels and restaurants who are serving the tourist trade, they're always careful to use both names because you don't want to offend anyone that might be your customer, right? So in 1947, Congress passes a resolution officially saying, hey, this is the Hoover Dam. But during that time period, there was a lot of debate amongst the editorial pages on different newspapers about which name you should use. And one other little engineering question, this I find fascinating. So in those days, Hoover had to actually go back to California to vote in 1932. Of course, we know he lost, and he's very much in support of engineers. He thinks engineers are a noble profession that help move society forward. And so when he lost, he suspected that when Hoover Dam was completed, he would not be invited to the ceremonies, and he was correct. So he asked his people, if we went to the Hoover Dam site and I gave a speech, it will be the middle of the night. Am I going to be able to do that? And they said, yes, Mr. President, they have lights there. So the 8-hour train trip from California to the Hoover Dam, Hoover wrote his speech. He gave a speech at the Hoover Dam which didn't talk about politics at all. It talked about engineering and how America's moved forward and how important engineers are to society. It's one of the few times, perhaps the only time by design, that he ended up being a day late to Washington and missed some of his appointments and stuff. But it was very vitally important for him to stop at Hoover Dam and make that speech about engineering before going back to Washington.
So Craig, we're at 3 o'clock my time, 2 o'clock your time. Are you okay with 5 minutes more of questions?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So great. We still have a few good ones here. An anonymous attendee asks, how did people react to Hoover being the first Quaker president? And a follow-up question from Scott was wondering if Hoover abstained from alcohol.
Okay, those are very interesting. I don't believe there was, I'm not aware of any pushback for him being a Quaker. And frankly, the 1928 election, religion played a role for those who were anti-Catholic because his opponent was Catholic. But Hoover, I don't think, and some of the people listening in might know there was a second Quaker president, and that was Richard Nixon. And so those are our two Quaker presidents. Interestingly, Nixon has relatives in West Branch, Iowa. Someone I think had asked, where is the library? And it's in West Branch, Iowa, which is very close to Iowa City, just 10 miles east. But we have a picture of like a 20-year-old Richard Nixon visiting his family here in West Branch. Remind me the second part of the question.
Did he drink alcohol?
Oh, he did drink alcohol. He did have quite a wine cellar in California that I believe his wife made him get rid of all the wine once Prohibition passed. And Hoover did not, he got around this because when he was in Washington, he was still very close friends, obviously, with the Belgians from having done all the food relief. So the Belgian embassy was not considered US soil. So he would go to the Belgian embassy and drink there legally during Prohibition, but he didn't drink his own alcohol until Prohibition was repealed.
So Craig,
oh, also,
I had some, oh yeah,
go ahead. I have one interesting alcohol story because Hoover, towards the end of his life, was always known for having 2 martinis each night. And as he was getting old and his health was deteriorating somewhat, his doctor said, you got to stop drinking 2 martinis every night. It's not good for your health. And Hoover basically said, how about if I only drink 1 instead of 2? And the doctor said, great, that's at least a step in the right direction. So they had a martini glass made that was twice as big as normal, and he would have his 1 martini every night. We have that in our museum. Yeah, in our museum collection. It's not always on display in the museum, but we have that big martini glass in our collection.
I'm going to use that. That's a good one. So we had a couple of folks email questions in advance. I'm just going to read one of them.
Sure.
So this comes from Bernice. It's a long one. I'm going to kind of consolidate it. But basically, she many years ago was watching C-SPAN, heard a wonderful presentation on Lou, and thinks that Lou is one of the top 5 first ladies in American history. Absolutely fascinating. I was enthralled with her interest in sports, geology, fluent in Chinese, the Girl Scouts, amateur athletics, 4-H, other volunteer groups, love for animals. So here's the question. Since she did not have a social secretary and apparently didn't with the social side of DC much, I was wondering if she had much or any contact with Grace Coolidge or Eleanor Roosevelt before and after Herbert Hoover's presidency.
Okay, so actually, she extended the social season in Washington while she was there, further into the spring, much to the delight of the people who love that. She was very close. I would say there's a lot of correspondence. I believe it's fair to say she was close to Grace Coolidge. And there's correspondence from them, obviously, from the time that Bert was Secretary of Commerce through the post-presidency. her and Eleanor Roosevelt they were courteous to each other, but they were not close in any way. And a lot of the reason Lou has been overlooked, in that there's been a lot of interest her in the last few years. The family had the right, so they chose to have her papers closed to the public until 20 years after Herbert Hoover died. So Herbert Hoover dies in 1964. So Lou Henry Hoover's papers aren't open for public research until 1985. And what had happened in that intervening period is you had the first generation of sort of women's history scholars re-examining the first ladies. But Lou sort of gets overlooked because her papers aren't open to the public yet. So there's been some interesting work done with Lou lately, a couple of biographies. Personally, I have high hopes. There's a young student at one of the Florida universities who did her junior dissertation on Lou, loved it so much that she did her senior thesis on Lou, won awards and is presented at conferences, and she's now going to graduate school at the University of Alabama. They asked her what she wanted to study, and she explained Lou Henry Hoover, and now all these people are excited. So in the back of my mind, I hope that she'll write the definitive biography down the road. But there's a lot of work to be done with Lou still.
Yeah, and speaking of Lou, final question goes to Nancy, who asks, was Lou considered a feminist during her lifetime?
I think it would be fair to say she didn't consider herself to be one, but I think she's been adopted by feminists because she lived her. See, and in some ways, she has a very interesting speech about the right to vote after the women get it. And people have been sort of pressing her and she goes, in a sense, she goes, my experience is different because I've been allowed in my life to do whatever I want. So she hasn't felt the same kind of restrictions perhaps other women did. She does say that once women have the right to vote, it's up to them to get educated and make vote. And she actually makes very impassioned pleas that hopefully women voters can help get more money open for education, because both of the Hoovers thought education was vital to people have upward mobility.
So folks, let's give Craig a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. Didn't mean to cut you off there, Craig.
That's all right.
But so I know that there were 3 or 4 questions we didn't quite get to. Craig does have his email address up on the screen. I did just put it in the chat, so feel free to reach out and email him a question or two if you'd like. I'll also include the email address in the follow-up email that I send you all tomorrow. Also in that email will be the recording, a feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming virtual programs. We have a couple more with presidential libraries this month. Next month we'll be next Tuesday, we'll be visited by the Gerald Ford Presidential Library, which I'm looking forward to. Craig, I'm going to save the chat for you because we have a lot of folks saying nice things about you in the chat. Any last words, Craig, before we wrap it up?
I just say thank you for attending, and frankly, I'm in charge of distributing digitized stuff. So if you're curious about anything and want maybe to see one of Lou's diaries or whatever, get a hold of me. I'm happy to forward stuff that we've scanned already for you to look at more closely if you'd like.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Craig. It was a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for this great presentation. And I hope the audience, everyone watching, has a great rest of their day. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep, thank you.